Hello everyone and welcome to another limited review video. I'm Hone, and ever since it was spoiled on last Friday, I've been doing a color by color limited review of every single card in Amonkhet. So far I've covered white, blue, and black, and today we're covering red. Tomorrow I'll be covering green, and the next day multicolored cards, artifacts, and lands. Before we get into reviewing every single red card in Amonkhet, a quick reminder on how I grade these cards. If you've already seen this on one of the other videos, you can skip ahead to the discussion of the first red card using a timestamp in the description. I'm going to be using letter grades in this limited review. That is what the overwhelming majority of people voted for in a Twitter poll that I conducted. If you'd like to see a different method, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, let's go through each of these letter grades, and for each of them I'll give some examples from Kaladesh block that I would have given these grades. So as you may have expected, A is the best grade that a card can get. Well, A+ is actually, but those are few and far between. A's are cards that are so powerful that they completely shift a game in your favor, almost regardless of the board state. They are also so strong that they pull you into their colors and tempt you to find a way to splash them. They are most frequently made up of rares and mythics, though the occasional uncommon does find its way in there. Some examples of this from Kaladesh block would be cards like Herald of Anguish and Verdurous Gearhulk. These are basically the cards that you most want to open and pick in your first pack because they give your deck such a massive power boost. Next up, we have cards that receive a B. These are still great cards, but not quite as game-warping as A-level cards. This category is made up of cards that should basically always be making the cut in your deck if they're in your color. This includes premium removal and extremely efficient and powerful creatures. Cards at this grade level don't tempt you to change your entire draft the way A-level cards do, but they make the cut 100% of the time in your deck if you're in their colors. Most frequently, these are of uncommon rarity or higher, though sometimes commons get in the mix. Some examples of this from Kaladesh block are Thopter Arrest and Scrapper Champion. Next, there are C-level cards. While A's and B's are the kind of cards you're happy to first pick, C's aren't quite as exciting. They're the kind of card that basically always makes your deck if they're in your color, but aren't incredibly powerful. Here is where you find solid and efficient creatures as well as decent removal, and this is usually what the majority of your deck is actually made up of. Some examples of C-level cards from Kaladesh block are cards like Ether Swooper and Shock. Basically, these are all cards you feel good about having in your deck, but not great about taking super early. So in an ideal world, your deck will be made up entirely of cards in the A through C range. That's something to keep in mind in general as I go through cards in this list and in the other limited review videos. Cards in the D and F range are not cards you generally want in your deck. However, D cards aren't entirely terrible, but they're cards that frequently get cut from your deck and are basically just filler to help you with your curve. Generally, things have to go a little bit wrong during your draft for you to end up with more than a few D cards in your deck, as you are stretching to include every playable card you drafted if they're showing up there. Some examples of this are Ether Inspector and Reservoir Walker. Both of these cards are cards I ended up playing a few times in the format, but I was never very happy to have to do it. Generally, most decks are made up of B's and C's because A's are so rare and D's are mediocre playables that will sometimes make the cut. However, there is a grade even worse than D, obviously, and that is F. These are cards that I consider utterly unplayable and shouldn't end up in your deck for any reason. These are the cards that always seem to be the last cards you pick up in booster packs. Some recent examples of this would be Gonti's Machinations and Take Into Custody. A few more words on grading. There's some more nuance to it in many cases. I will give some cards a grade range instead of just a single letter grade because some cards are stone unplayable in some decks but become very good if your deck meets certain requirements. A good example of this from Ether Revolt is Efficient Construction. This card just gets a straight F if you have less than 5 artifacts, but if you get to 10 or more, it suddenly becomes a B. These type of nuances show up from time to time while grading cards, and I will draw your attention to them when we run into cards like it. There are also cards that aren't very good main board, but are pretty good out of the sideboard. For these cards, I will give grades based on how good I think the card would be in my main board, but also a sideboard grade that reflects how happy I am to have that card available out of my sideboard. A good example of this is Takedown, which is a D main board, but a B out of your sideboard. Now let's look at all the red cards in Amonkhet, starting with On-Crop Crasher. On-Crop Crasher is 2 colorless and 1 red for a 3/2 Minotaur Warrior with haste, and he has You may exert On-Crop Crasher as it attacks. When you do, target creature can't block this turn. This is the first time we've seen exert in this particular video, so I will remind you what it does. Basically, you can choose when you attack with a creature who can exert itself to have it not untap during your next untap step to get an extra bonus. Here, a creature can't block is the bonus you get. I like this card quite a bit. It reminds me of Goblin Heel Cutter and Voldaren Duelist, both of which were very powerful cards in their respective formats. Those two cards were also commons though, and Uncropped Crasher comes in at the uncommon rarity. Probably a good call, since both of the previous cards I mentioned were pretty powerful for commons. A 3-mana 3/2 with haste would already be a playable card. Adding the option to exert this guy and make a creature unable to block is huge, especially because with haste he can do it the turn that he comes into play. In an aggro deck, the ability to make something unable to block is often enough to open the floodgates on your opponent, allowing your entire board to attack. The cost of the Crasher not untapping for a turn isn't a huge one if you're the beatdown either, and your opponent knows another turn where you could exert it could be in the near future, and they have to sort of defend themselves against that. While he is at his best in an aggro deck, the Crasher is fine overall in any deck, thanks to having solid stats. Overall, I'd give the Crasher a B. It is a card I actively want in an aggro deck, and it is possible for it to be first pickable in the weaker packs you open. Ideally, you probably don't want to take him until pick 3 or 4, though. Next, we have Battlefield Scavenger, who for 1 colorless and 1 red is a 2/2 Jackal Rogue, who has you may exert Battlefield Scavenger as it attacks, and then it says whenever you exert a creature, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. Battlefield Scavenger is a solid little card. He is a 2-mana 2/2, something any deck will play, and he comes with a little bit of upside thanks to Exert, and he's sort of an Exert Lord too because he cares about anytime you exert any creature, not just himself. His Exert is, well, not the most powerful. Just letting you rummage is not a huge deal. However, he is a 2-mana 2/2 with some upside, and while rummaging isn't huge, especially at the cost of keeping a guy from untapping, there are definitely going to be times when that's what you want to do because you really need to draw a land or some other card, and sort of discarding 3 cards and drawing 3 cards is sometimes going to be what you want. What's more is there are some cards that give you a payoff when you discard a card, making this even better. Basically, a 2-mana 2/2 with no downside is already going to be a C in any format, and one with a bit of upside, like the Scavenger, gets a C+ from me. But he's pretty solid 2-drop by the middle part of the pack, and you could probably even take him a little earlier than that if you're getting a lot of creatures with Exert. Next, we have Blazing Volley, which is 1 red mana for a sorcery, and it says Blazing Volley deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. This isn't a very good card. There just aren't enough X1s in this set, or small tokens in this set, for it to be good. It's an okay sideboard card, I guess, because sometimes you'll run into an opponent who does happen to have all the X1s ever, but it just isn't going to be that common, so it isn't even a card you always want on your sideboard. Blazing Volley is an F mainboard, and probably a D+ or so out of your sideboard. Next, we have Bloodlust Insider, who for 1 red mana is a 1/1, and he's a human warrior, and he says target creature gains haste until end of turn, and he can tap to give a creature haste. This is another card I'm not too interested in playing. Sure, this 1 mana 1/1 can do something in the late game, but haste isn't a keyword ability that is always relevant the way evasive abilities are. Sometimes you're just going to be playing a 2/2 or something, and it won't be able to attack through your opponent's 4/4 anyway, so the ability to give haste to something isn't something you'll be using every turn. This is the type of card that you will end up playing sometimes, but only if something went wrong in your draft. I wouldn't take it early or even willingly take it really, so I'm going to give it a D. Next, we have Blood Rage Brawler, who for 1 colorless and 1 red is a 4/3 Minotaur Warrior, and it says when Blood Rage Brawler enters the battlefield, discard a card. 2 mana for a 4/3 is pretty great, and this creature is just about the most impactful thing you can play on turn 2 in this format, at least at common or uncommon. What's more is the downside it offers won't be as much of a downside as it seems to be. This format has lots of cards that trigger when you discard cards, it has lots of cards that do things from the graveyard, and it has the black-red archetype in particular, which likes to discard cards and have as few cards in hand as possible. As a result, this 2 mana 4/3's downside will be lessened enough of the time that it won't feel like much of a downside. I'm willing to give Blood Rage Brawler a B-. The size and efficiency of this creature is hard to say no to, and I think it's worth a relatively early pick. Next, we have Brute Strength, which is a reprint, and it's 1 colorless and 1 red for an instant, and it gives target creature +3/+1 and trample until end of turn. This is a serviceable combat trick. It pumps your creature's toughness, so it makes it so that your creature will survive combat and kill your opponent's creature a decent amount of the time, and get in for damage thanks to trample, but 1 toughness isn't a huge boost, and you'll find yourself in unfortunate situations where the best you can do is 2 for 1 yourself to kill your opponent's creature in combat, and do a few damage while playing this spell, and that's not very good. So this isn't the kind of combat trick you're really counting on getting in your aggro deck. You'll play it though, some of the time in aggro decks, generally when you're short on efficient removal and playables in general, but I'm going to give this card a D+. Next, we have By Force, which is a sorcery that costs X and 1 red mana, and it says destroy X target artifacts. So there seems to be a lot of efficient artifact destruction spells that were printed in Amonkhet. but they actually aren't very good in Amonkhet Limited, as there aren't a ton of artifacts in the set. There are some, sure, but it seems that most of this artifact destruction was printed with constructed in mind as an escape hatch in case artifacts were too good from Kaladesh block. As a result, these artifact destruction spells are actually pretty bad in this format and aren't even worth mainboarding, and aren't the greatest card out of the sideboard either. I give this an F in the mainboard and a C+ out of the sideboard, because you can really get some great value out of it if your opponent does happen to be playing a few artifacts. I think it's worth giving a C+ to, but it's going to be hard to find an opponent who is. Next, we have Cartouche of Zeal, which for 1 red mana is an enchantment or a cartouche, and it says enchant creature you control. When Cartouche of Zeal enters the battlefield, target creature can't block this turn. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has haste. Cartouche of Zeal is the first of the cartouches we have looked at this week that does not do something to mitigate against getting you 2 for 1, the way that offensive auras often do. However, I think what it does is powerful and efficient enough that it is still a solid playable. Giving a creature +1/+1 and haste for 1 red would be enough to get an aura into the I'll play it if I have to range, in other words, a D, but adding the ability to make a creature unable to block is pretty big, especially in aggressive decks. As I mentioned with On-Crop Crasher, making your opponent's best blocker not matter is often huge for your aggro deck, and this does it for only 1 mana, while also allowing your newest creature to attack. This card, as well as On-Crop Crasher, are the kind of card aggro decks can use to lead to big blowouts. Though, if you get some trials, obviously it gets better. I'm only going to give this card a C. It is the kind of card I would pick up in the latter half of the pack, not one that I would go after hard, at least not early. If I'm looking at what I've drafted and my deck is loaded with aggressive 2 and 3 drops by pack 3, though, I think I would go after this card a little bit harder. Next, we have Combat Celebrant, who is 2 colorless and 1 red mana for a 4/1 human warrior. And it says if Combat Celebrant hasn't been exerted this turn, you may exert it as it attacks. When you do, untap all other creatures you control, and after this phase, there is an additional combat phase. This is a weird card. He has weird stats. Being a 4/1 isn't something we see every day, and these stats make him very fragile. However, his exert trigger is perhaps the strongest one in the entire set, and I guess that's why he's a mythic rare. He makes another combat phase happen if you exert him, and let's face it, he's going to die in combat, so that you don't get to do this again, because he's a 4/1 and it's so powerful your opponent will just block it with whatever, but that's probably okay, since another combat phase is a very real thing. Where he synergizes really well is if you have other creatures with exert who you exerted in your first combat phase, because they get to untap and can exert all over again. They only don't untap during your next untap phase, so untapping them with an effect like Combat Celebrants lets you do it all over again. That seems like one of the more fun achievement unlocked moments in Amonkhet Draft, but this card does have some problems. One of them is that if you don't already have a significant board presence, he's pretty bad. He's just a 3 mana 4/1. Say you have a 2-drop and this guy in play. You're not exactly lighting the world on fire with that. In some ways, the Celebrant is a win more card, although I think it deserves a little bit more credit than that because it's a card that can help break you out of a board stall. However, if you're playing from behind, it's a pretty bad card, and if you are ahead with the kind of board that the Celebrant can really abuse, you're probably already going to win. All this comes with a very fragile body that dies to basically everything in the format, even a single -1/-1 counter, and because of that, I'm going to give him a C+. He might be a mythic, and he might be a lot of fun, but you shouldn't take him early. He isn't going to be the bomb you envision him being the majority of the time. Trust me. Next, we have Consuming Fervor. For 1 red mana, this is an enchantment aura with enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature gets +3/+3 and has, at the beginning of your upkeep, put a -1/-1 counter on this creature. This is a color-shifted unstable mutation, which is pretty cool. This set has in general impressed me with its auras. The majority of them are either efficient enough to make me consider them at least somewhat playable, or do something to avoid the dreaded 2-for-1. Consuming Fervor falls in the former category, as 1 mana for +3/+3 is a massive boost. Yes, your creature will get smaller eventually, but your overall investment of 1 mana is going to be worth it. It has the problem of opening you up to 2-for-1s, of course, but at least you aren't spending a ton of mana on this aura. What's more is there are some creatures, especially green ones, and black ones, who like -1/-1 counters and can find things to do with them while they continue to beat down on your opponent. That's going to be a very powerful thing to pull off, and if your opponent doesn't have an answer, they're probably going to die to your huge creature. All that said, Consuming Fervor isn't incredible, but it is another playable aura, a solid one for any aggressive deck, and because of that, it gets a C from me. Next, we have Deem Worthy, which for 4 generic mana and 1 red mana is an instant that says Deem Worthy deals 7 damage to target creature. It also has Cycling for 3 and a red, and it says when you cycle Deem Worthy, you may have it deal 2 damage to target creature. This is the first card with Cycling we've seen in this particular video, so I'll remind you what it does. It gives you an option to pay a cost and discard the card to draw a card. And in this case, Deemworthy does something extra when it's cycled, so it doesn't just draw you a card, it does 2 damage to target creature. As I've said with the other cards that do something when they cycle, I think a good way of thinking about them is as split cards. In this case, on one side you have a 5 mana instant that does 7 to a creature at instant speed, and on the other side a 4 mana instant that does 2 damage to a creature and draws you a card. Both of these cards would individually be good. The first one a B- and the second one a C+. But both of them together allows you the flexibility to do whichever one is more important for you, and this flexibility makes this card good at every stage of the game. 7 damage is enough to take down almost every creature in this format, and while the 5 mana is a little clunky, at least the spell is instant speed. Sometimes you only need to do 2 to kill something problematic, and this can do it at a reduced cost with an added cantrip, so that's not too bad. This card is a solid B, the kind every single red deck wants, and one that is a reasonable first pick. Next, we have Desert Cerodon, who for 4 colorless and 1 red mana is a 6/4 and beast, and he has cycling for 1 red mana. 6 mana for a 6/4 isn't exactly what you want to be doing on the top of your curve, and on its own would probably make this card a D-, a card you would play only after a train wreck draft. But this has the addition of a pretty efficient cycling cost, which certainly makes it a little better in a set loaded with payoffs for cycling. That said, your cycling deck is going to be better if the cards with cycling you're playing are actually solid when you cast them too, and Desert Cerodon doesn't quite get there for me. I'm going to give it a D. You'll only play this in a deck that either has an insane number of cycling synergies or if your deck went wrong. Next we have Electrify, which is 3 colorless and 1 red mana for an instant, and it says Electrify deals 4 damage to target creature. This is the uninteresting but good common removal spell that red gets in every set. 4 mana for 4 damage at instant speed is good, and can kill a large percentage of the creatures in the format. That's good, and even worth a first pick in a weaker pack. This card gets a B- from me. Next, we have Emberhorn Minotaur, who for 3 colorless and 1 red is a 4/3, and he says you may exert Emberhorn Minotaur as it attacks. When you do, it gets +1/+1 and gains menace until end of turn. This guy is pretty savage. 4 mana for a 4/3 is pretty solid in limited formats. Just ask Summit Prowler. 4 mana for a 5/4 with menace that can attack every couple of turns is pretty nice, and he isn't going to be easy to block without your opponent getting 2 for 1 in the early stages of the game. This is a very good common for red, maybe even the best common creature red got in this format, and I'm willing to give it a B-. If you were seeing this guy get around the table, red is almost definitely open, because I'd be willing to snatch him up as early as pick 5 or 6. Next, we have Flameblade Adept. 1 red mana for a 1/2 Jackal Warrior with Menace, and it says whenever you cycle or discard a card, Flameblade Adept gets +1/+0 until end of turn. This card is one of the cycling payoffs in the format, but I don't think it is an especially good one. 1 mana for a 1/2 with Menace probably isn't quite enough for a card to get out of the D range, as it will quickly get outclassed and can even just be double blocked by 2 1/1s. But this card will sometimes play a little bit like Monastery Swiftspear. Your opponent will have to decide whether double blocking it is worth it, and you have to weigh what the chances are that you cycle something at instant speed to make the adept bigger. However, where it isn't as good as a Swiftspear is in the fact that it doesn't pump its toughness. So 2 power worth of creatures is always going to be enough to take this thing down. This means that this creature does not scale well as the game goes on. In the end, I don't like this card a whole lot. I would need to both be very aggressive and end a ton of cards with cycling, 2 things that probably won't go together super well to want to run this. I can see playing it if I'm short on playables. It isn't completely horrible, but it doesn't do enough for me to get out of the D range. Next, we have Fling, which is a reprint for 1 and a red. It's an instant, and it says as an additional cost to cast Fling, sacrifice a creature. Fling deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to target creature or player. This card has been good in some formats, but not so much here, I don't think. The ideal thing is to use Fling on a creature who is being targeted by removal, or to use it on a creature with Embalm in this format, so you don't really lose a whole card. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of the time, Fling is going to just 2 for 1 yourself, and you aren't always going to have creatures who are even worth sacrificing to Fling. Sacrificing a 2/2 who's being targeted by Magma Spray seems decent, but not much more than that, especially if your opponent doesn't have an X2 for you to kill. Sometimes Fling can result in an amazing blowout on your opponent, but that is going to be a small percentage of the time. The rest of the time, Fling is the kind of card that is awkward in your hand, and you have to wait for an ideal board state for it to work out for you. And because of that, I'm not normally going to be playing Fling. I don't think it is completely unplayable, because it is still removal, but it is a D. I do think it's going to be a little better out of the sideboard against decks with lots of aura-based removal, particularly blue-white decks will have several common aura removal spells, and it gets a little better there because you can, after a creature becomes useless thanks to the aura, you can use Fling on it. But even then, it probably only makes it up to a D+, and I'm just going to give it sort of a main board grade of a D. Next, we have Glorious End. This card is a really cool design. It's 2 colorless and 1 red mana for an instant, and it says in the turn. And I'm going to read the reminder text on this card. I don't normally, but it's important here because in the turn aren't 3 words you see very often on a card. And it says, exile all spells and abilities on the stack, including this card. The players whose turn it is discards down to his or her maximum hand size. Damage wears off, and this turn and until end of turn effects end. At the beginning of your next end step, you lose the game. This card is a very cool design and can effectively give red counter magic and can let you time walk your opponent if you cast this during your upkeep. But that other line of text on the card, you lose the game, is a doozy and not something you want to see on a card in Limited because this means there's only one time this card is effective. If you just need to stop your opponent during their turn and you can win the game on your turn. The rest of the time, the card is just dead in your hand, and because of that, I can't warrant recommending to play this card in Amonkhet Limited, so I'm going to give it an F. Next, we have Glorybringer. 5 mana, 3 colorless and 2 red, that is, for a dragon who is a 4/4 with flying and haste, and it says you may exert Glorybringer as it attacks. When you do, it deals 4 damage to target non-dragon creature an opponent controls. This card is nuts. So 5 mana for a 4/4 with flying and haste is already going to be a B+. This comes with the added bonus that it can do 4 damage to one of your opponent's creatures by exerting yourself. That means that this is a huge monster in the air that puts your opponent on a quick clock, while also being able to, when you need it to, burn your opponent's creatures out of the way. Removal combined with a big dragon is something that is always going to be good and really at every single stage of the game. As a result, this card gets a straight up A and is the kind of card you would ideally want to start a draft with. Next, we have Harsh Mentor, which for 1 colorless and 1 red is a 2/2 human cleric, and it says whenever an opponent activates an ability of an artifact, creature, or land on the battlefield, if it isn't a mana ability, Harsh Mentor deals 2 damage to that player. Harsh Mentor is a 2 mana 2/2. This is something that basically every deck wants a few of. Evaluating them beyond that is somewhat difficult. Your opponents aren't going to have a ton of activated abilities in this format, but they'll have some. And some opponents will get punished really hard by Harsh Mentor. Other people, he's just going to be a 2 mana 2/2, and his text box won't mean anything. The wide variance on this card makes me want to grade it basically as a 2 mana 2/2 and ignore the text box, which is good enough for a C, though obviously against some people, he'll be a little bit better than that. Next, we have Hazaret the Fervent, which for 3 colorless and 1 red is a 5/4 legendary god with indestructible and haste. Hazaret the Fervent, it says, can't attack or block unless you have 1 or fewer cards in hand. His activated ability is 2 generic and 1 red. Discard a card. Hazaret deals 2 damage to each opponent. Like all the gods, Hazaret is big and indestructible and asks you to jump through some hoops so he can actually put that big body to use, while also giving you a way to jump through said hoops. For Hazaret, you have to have 1 or fewer cards in your hand for him to be active, and he helps you get there by pitching cards to do 2 damage to your opponent. That kind of ability is already a fine mana sink and a great way of getting rid of extra lands in the late game. Additionally, Hazaret's requirement is actually a pretty easy one to achieve. Organically, it'll just sort of happen. In most Limited games that go medium length or longer, you're going to end up in top deck mode anyway, provided you are playing all of your cards, and you will be if you have Hazaret, and that means Hazaret is ready to roll even if you top deck him, which is nice in the late game. This actually makes him a better top deck than most of the gods, as the others require you to do things that don't happen as naturally over the course of a game. All that said, a 5/4 with haste isn't the most powerful of the gods in terms of stats, and it can easily be chump blocked. In some ways, the best thing to do with this god might just be to hang back and have him as an incredibly good blocker while you continue to do 2 damage to your opponent every turn. You can also, of course, be bashing him into your opponent's creatures every turn, which isn't a bad idea either. They're going to run out of them eventually. All of this together makes Hazaret a B+ for me. I wouldn't quite describe him as an A, but he's about as close as you can get without actually being one. Because he asks you to jump through hoops, like all the gods do, it's hard for me to give him an A-, especially because the payoff here isn't the biggest creature ever. I'd be happy first picking him in most packs, though, with only a few cards in the set being worth taking over him. Next, we have Hazaret's Fervor. 2 colorless and 1 red mana for an enchantment, and it says, at the beginning of combat on your turn, you have made target creature you control get +2/+0 and gain haste. If you do, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. I don't like this card very much. Sure, it gives a creature you just played haste and pumps its power. That can be especially nice with creatures with exert, but it also requires you to lose that creature at the end of your turn. While there are some creatures in this set that have abilities that trigger when they die, and then creatures with Embalm, there aren't enough of those to warrant playing this card in most situations. The benefits it offers just aren't worth the downside to me the majority of the time. I'm willing to concede that there may be times where a deck comes together that can be played in, and that's the only reason I'm not going to give it an F. A D- is pretty close, though. Next, we have Heart Piercer Manticore, which for 2 colorless and 2 red mana is a Manticore who is a 4/3, and it says, when Heart Piercer Manticore enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature. When you do, Heart Piercer Manticore deals damage equal to that creature's power to target creature or player, and he has an Embalm cost of 5 colorless and 1 red. This is the first time we've seen Embalm in this video, so I'll remind you what it does. It lets you exile the card from your graveyard to put a zombie copy that also happens to be white into play of the card. And in this case, you pay 5 and a red, and you get another copy of Heart Piercer Manticore in play, and you exile the Heart Piercer from your graveyard to do it. Heart Piercer Manticore's fail case of a 4-mana 4/3 is already a card that would be a C in limited. Once you tack everything else onto it, it gets a lot better. I'm a little surprised how limited this card is to some extent. For a rare, I don't think it would be unreasonable for it to be able to sacrifice itself to its own ability, effectively being a 4-mana do 4 damage spell. That isn't exactly broken, but it would make this card a lot better, especially since it's a rare. But it can't do that. It can only fling another creature, which is fine, especially if you have some expendable creatures who can kill themselves for the cause. You don't get 2 for 1 by the fling attached to Heart Piercer Manticore, because you're still going to have your Manticore in play, while fling doesn't add anything to the board. But still, it seems a little weak for a rare. It does have Embalm, meaning you can use its ability a second time and get a 4/3 out of your graveyard in the late game, which isn't bad at all. Because the Manticore is a 4/3 with removal attached to it, albeit conditional removal with a very real cost, and that can come out of the graveyard with Embalm, I want to give this card a B-, and I don't hate the idea of first picking this card, even if I wish it was a little bit stronger. Next, we have Hyena Pack, which for 2 generic and 2 red mana is a 3/4 Hyena, and that's it. The vanilla test here for a 4 mana 3/4 does an okay job. It's a little weird that it isn't a 4-mana 4/3. Red gets those all the time, and I think it would actually be slightly better if that's what it was. If your deck needs a 4-drop, there are worse places to look, but there are also a lot of better cards that could fill the slot. This card, in that way, is a classic D+. I think I will play it and have, if I have to, and I'm low on playable creatures or need some 4-drops, but if my draft went well, I probably have some better things to do with 4 mana. Next, we have Insult to Injury, which is a split card with Aftermath, and it's 2 generic and 1 red mana. For the part you can cast from your hand, it's a sorcery and says, damage can't be prevented this turn. If a source you control would deal damage this turn, it deals double that damage instead. Then the injury half has Aftermath, which means you can cast the card from your graveyard. Only this half of the card, the injury half, not the insult half, which you can only cast from your hand. And it says injury deals 2 damage to target creature and 2 damage to target player. All of these cards with Aftermath have sort of a choose-your-own-adventure element to them. You can choose to cast only the half of the card that you can cast from your hand, and then cash in the other half at a later stage in the game. Just the first half of this card isn't very good, though. Doubling your damage is nice, but it's kind of a win-more card in a lot of situations, and on its own probably wouldn't get more than a D+ for me. The Aftermath half of this card is very good, though, and if it were on its own, it would get a B. Frequently, the best way to view this particular split card is to just cast both halves, or in other words, treat it as a 6-drop. If you do that, you have a spell that does 4 damage to one creature and to your opponent, while also making the creatures you attack with that turn do double damage. That now is a very impactful card and a reasonable effect to get for 6 mana, and overall I think this card gets a B+, making it worth a first pick in a lot of packs. Next, we have Limits of Solidarity, which for 3 colorless and 1 red says gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature. It gains haste until end of turn, and it also has a cycling cost of 2. Apparently, we can't have a limited format without a threaten effect, and Limits of Solidarity is what we get here. I'm not usually a huge fan of threaten effects unless a format has a lot of sacrifice outlets, allowing you to steal and sacrifice your opponent's creature. Generally, I put a generic threaten effect at around D+. There are often board states where Limits of Solidarity is completely useless. Usually, it only gets cast when it's going to end the game, and frequently you'd rather just have another card in your hand than the threaten that helps you develop your board. And this lets you do that thanks to cycling. So it has a little bit of a payoff. I mean, it keeps you from being, it keeps itself from being quite as bad as a threaten as other threatens. There are enough payoffs for cycling in this set that this card gets pushed from a D+ to a C-. Not a huge boost, but it is certainly nice for a card to not be entirely useless when you draw it. Don't take the card early at all and only play it in the most aggressive of decks, but I think it's an okay playable in such a deck. Next, we have Magma Spray, which is a reprint for 1 red mana. It's an instant, and it says, Magma Spray deals 2 damage to target creature. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. Magma Spray is back, and just like last time, it is a solid removal spell. It is almost always going to trade up. That is, kill a creature that costs 2 or more mana, and the fact that it exiles the things it kills isn't irrelevant in this set either. Not with creatures with Embalm and other graveyard abilities. The efficiency of this card gets it all the way up to a B. A red deck would play as many copies of this as the draft is willing to give them, and it is even worth first picking in a lot of packs. Next, we have Manticore of the Gauntlet. 4 colorless and 1 red for a 5/4 Manticore. It says, when Manticore of the Gauntlet enters the battlefield, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature you control. Manticore of the Gauntlet does 3 damage to target opponent. 5 mana for a 5/4 is an okay cost, but if you don't have another creature to put the counter on, you're getting a 4/3, which isn't nearly as good. Coming into play and doing 3 to an opponent does make this a little better, though. This is kind of a weird card, though, because there aren't any red cards that can actually abuse -1/-1 counters. This is the only one that really does a lot with -1/-1 counters. It almost feels like this should have been black. Anyway, because the -1/-1 counter thing is harder to abuse in red, and because this isn't the most efficient of creatures when you get it as a 5/4, even when you get it as a 5/4, I should say, I'm going to give the Manticore of the Gauntlet a C-. I don't see myself playing it or wanting it in all my red decks, but it seems like okay filler. Next, we have Minotaur Sure Shot, who for 2 and a red is a 2/3 Minotaur Archer, and he has Reach, which means he can block creatures with flying, and he has 1 generic and 1 red mana. Minotaur Sure Shot gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Lately, we've been seeing Reach, which has traditionally been a green ability on more and more red cards. It is definitely a useful keyword ability to have, as a 2/3 on the ground can block a lot of flyers effectively. This Minotaur also comes with Fire Breathing that costs 1 and a red, and that doesn't hurt its value at all. Minotaur Sure Shot is the kind of 3-drop that you're neither excited nor sad about having in your deck, and that's basically the classic description of a C. Next, we have Nefkrop Entangler, which is 1 and a red for a 2/1 with Trample, who's a human warrior, and it says you may exert Nefkrop Entangler as it attacks. When you do, it gets +1/+2 until end of turn. 2 mana for 2/1 with Trample is kind of weird, since obviously this thing isn't going to be getting in for much trample damage. That said, the Entangler does come with Exert, which can allow you to keep attacking well after most 2/1s would be done turning sideways, since it pumps itself all the way up to a 3/3. The idea of playing this on turn 2 and then attacking with it on turn 3 is not going to be something your opponent can block. All that said, even the ability to be a 3/3 Trampler every other turn on offense doesn't make this an exciting card. It's just a 2-drop with a bit of upside, which I'm going to give a C+2. Next, we have Pathmaker Initiate, which for 1 and a red is a 2/1, a human wizard, and it says, target creature with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn, and it has to tap for that ability. So Pathmaker Initiate is another 2-drop with upside. Normally the upside it offers, though, isn't that great. However, I think it is real upside in this set thanks to the Exert mechanic. There are a few creatures who start out smallish, like Nefkrop Entangler, but being able to make them unblockable and then exert them seems pretty nice. Still, the upside that its ability offers isn't extreme, though the more Exert creatures who have 2 or less power you have, the better it gets. I don't think I want to give it more than a C. Next, we have Pursue Glory, which for 3 generic and 1 red says attacking creatures get +2/+0 until end of turn, and it has Cycling for 2 generic mana. I don't like this card very much. Red just doesn't have enough of a go-wide theme to really abuse it. Sure, red decks will be mostly aggressive, so you'll be playing a lot of creatures, but the fact that this doesn't pump toughness at all makes it hard to get a good deal when you're attacking with it, as chances are, if your opponent is blocking your guys, they're going to die. It is the kind of card I know I'm going to lose to in this format, since it does have the ability to just turn a board lethal out of nowhere, but it will spend a significant amount of time in your hand as a dead card. In fact, it'll probably do more of that than winning you games. Now, Cycling helps with that, since you can toss it in the late game if you draw it and your board isn't right for it, or in the early game if you have nothing else to do on turn 2, but it still doesn't get this card above a D+ for me. I don't plan on playing it very often. Next, we have Nimble Blade Kenra, which for 1 and a red is a 1/3 Jackal Warrior, and it has Prowess, which means whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. It has only been 1 block, but we already have a functional reprint of Sanguinary Mage. Just like in that set, Blue-Red is a Spells Matter archetype, so creatures with Prowess are going to be solid here. The presence of Cartouches and Trials, all of which are playable, makes creatures with Prowess pretty good too. A 2-mana 1/3 with upside is definitely a C, and is even playable in a world where you end up with very few non-creature spells, though ideally you would play it in a deck that has several of them. This thing has basically has a high floor but a low ceiling, and that is a perfect C card. Never take this early, but if you find yourself with a decent number of non-creature spells and this gets passed to you late in a pack, don't hesitate to take it. Next, we have Soul Scar Mage, which is 1 red mana for a 1/2 with the Prowess ability, and it says, if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to a creature an opponent controls, put that many -1/-1 counters on that creature instead. I'm not super high on this card. Prowess is nice, and this card probably is a more deserving comparison to Monastery Swiftspear than Flameblade Adept, since it also gets a toughness boost, but I just don't see this card doing enough. Sure, it can make your burn spells and other non-combat sources of damage do damage in -1/-1 counters instead, which is nice, but this is limited, and you're not going to end up with a ton of ways to do that. If you do, then by all means you should probably want this card, but you won't have to go out of your way to get it, because in most decks it is just a bad Monastery Swiftspear that I'm not particularly interested in running. I'd rather have a Nimbleblade Kenra in most situations, and that puts this card at a D+ for me. Next, we have Sweltering Suns, which for 1 red, 1 colorless, and 2 red, is a sorcery that says Sweltering Sun deals 3 damage to each creature, and it also has a cycling for 3 generic mana. Board sweepers are pretty nice, and this one deals with smaller creatures. But I would say that this does kill the majority of creatures, and is the exact kind of card you're going to want in a control deck. Even in a more aggressive deck, if you know this is in your hand, you can play the game in such a way to minimize how many of your own creatures get killed by Sweltering Suns, and let your opponent continue to try to curve out, and you can get a pretty easy 3-for-1 on turn 4 or so. It also comes with the added bonus of cycling. In the event the board isn't one you want to use Sweltering Suns on, though, most of the time you aren't going to want to be cycling this. This is a card I feel solid about first picking or taking early, because it can just win the game on its own. However, its situational nature, and its fitting better specifically in more controlling decks, limits me from giving it an A, though I am willing to give it a B+. Next, we have Thresher Lizard, which for 2 colorless and 1 red is a 3/2 lizard that says Thresher Lizard gets +1/+2 as long as you have 1 or fewer cards in your hand. I like this guy. 3 mana for 3/2 is decent on the vanilla test, probably about a D+, and turning into a 4/4 when you have 1 or fewer cards in your hand is nice. It means this guy can stay relevant for longer in the game than your average 3/2 can. He's nothing special, but I don't think any red deck would be sad to have a couple of these as 3-drops. They won't be too excited about it either, though, and I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Tormenting Voice, which for 1 colorless and 1 red is a sorcery, and it says as an additional cost, to cast Tormenting Voice, discard a card, draw 2 cards. Is Tormenting Voice ever going to rotate out of standard? I mean, it keeps getting printed everywhere, but anyway, Tormenting Voice isn't that great in limited. It's not bad either. It's a decent way to see more of your deck, and drawing 2 cards for 2 mana is pretty nice. The trick here is to discard something with Embalm or Aftermath, so you aren't even discarding a real card, though I think discarding a land is better than either of those options. Still, even with this graveyard-heavy set, I don't think Tormenting Voice is as good as it was in Shadows over Innistrad, where it had Madness backing it up. I'm going to give it a D. You'll play it sometimes, but usually as your 23rd card, and you won't be too super stoked about it. Next, we have Trueheart Twins, which for 4 colorless and 1 red is a 4/4 Jackal Warrior. And it says you may exert Trueheart Twins as it attacks. Whenever you exert a creature, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. This is a pretty good card, and a good reason to shove a lot of cards with exert into your deck. 5 mana for a 4/4 isn't great, but it is basically a 5 mana 4/4 who, even just alone, pumps your whole board +1/+0 when it attacks, including itself. So it becomes a 5/4, and that is a pretty good card, just without the exert clause that it has. They do have to exert themselves to do it, so you may not do it every turn, but the fail case of a 5 mana 4/4 isn't bad. If you have more cards with exert, you don't even have to exert the twins to get the boost, and you can end up with even more of a boost, obviously, if you're exerting 3 or 4 creatures. I think the twins are a B- and push further into the B range in a deck with several creatures with exert. Next, we have Trial of Zeal, which for 2 generic and 1 red mana is an enchantment that says when Trial of Zeal enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to target creature or player. It also says when a cartouche enters the battlefield under your control, return Trial of Zeal to its owner's hand. Say hello to the best card in the Trial cycle, at least in limited. 3 mana to do 3 damage to a creature or player is generally already going to get a B because it's fairly efficient removal. This comes with the added bonus of being able to be recast if you play a cartouche, and this is probably the best one to cast repeatedly since you end up getting a ridiculous amount of value out of this card. Even just casting it twice can be backbreaking for your opponent. I'm going to give this card a B+, but with the caveat that it becomes even better the more cartouches you have. Next, we have Violent Impact, which for 3 generic and 1 red mana is a sorcery that says destroy target artifact or land. It also has a cycling for 2 generic mana. Finally, they reprinted a strictly better Demolition. That's awesome. Not really, though. There's a card like this in basically all limited formats, and I always say to myself, well, I'll side in Demolition sometimes, right? But I really never do. It's too clunky at blowing up artifacts, and blowing up lands isn't usually a smart route to take in limited. It does come with cycling, so if you don't have a good target, you can do that. But as I've said about other cards, wouldn't you rather have a card with cycling that doesn't make you feel bad about actually casting it? Cycling keeps its impact from being a mainboard F. I'll give it a D-. I guess I have an F there, but let's say D-. and I think it maxes out at a D+, even out of your sideboard. Next, we have Warfire Javelineer, which for 3 generic and 1 red mana is a 2/3 Minotaur warrior. And it says, when Warfire Javelineer enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to target creature an opponent controls, where X is the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. Your standard limited deck is probably only going to have 4 to 5 instants and sorceries, and if that's what you've got, don't play Warfire Javelineer. Now, the blue-red archetype in this set is all about instants and sorceries, so in that deck it will be quite nice, and a card you really want to go after, since doing 3 damage when this comes into play won't be very hard, and that's pretty good. 3 or more, even doing 2 is pretty good, but 3 or more is great. Because of the variance here, I'm going to give the Javelineer 2 grades. Basically, in any deck that's not blue-red or has a normal number of instants and sorceries, it's just an F. In the blue-red deck, though, I think it's probably a B-, so that's some pretty big variance to keep in mind. If your deck is blue-red, you want this guy, badly. If it isn't, you don't. Warfire Javelineer is the last red card in Amonkhet, so this color's review is now complete. Tomorrow, I will continue my limited review by talking about all the green cards in Amonkhet. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button. If you disagree with the grades or the discussion on one of the cards, let me know in the comments. Discussing these things is going to make all of us better at drafting this format. Also, if you want to make sure you catch the rest of this limited review, as well as Amonkhet draft videos, don't forget to subscribe. Additionally, my content is supported in part by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for Magic content. They have an awesome app that you can use to practice drafting this even before it's out in paper or online. One of the things that 5Color Combo is best known for is their sweet original playmats and tokens, and right now they are running a Kickstarter campaign that is very close to ending, so you should act quickly if you're interested in this. And they're running the campaign to help fund more tokens, and you get 4 tokens as part of for donating, including these 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse zombie tokens, which are pretty awesome. And you can find more information about the Kickstarter in the description below. Thanks for watching.